Okay, everyone, thanks for coming along. First of all, I start off by acknowledging the Wiradjuri people, who are the traditional custodians of the land I'm joining you from today. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from which each of you are joining us, and I'd like to pay my respect to the elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians who may be present here today. So I'm Kylie Dunstan. I'm with the Southern NSW Innovation Hub, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to our first webinar series for Expanded Horizons, where we want to challenge you all to just take a little bit of time and think outside your normal, so outside your industry, your community, your region, and your profession. So we're going to get started with Joshua Gilbert, a Worimi man, farmer and academic, who's going to speak to us about Indigenous agriculture. So welcome aboard, Josh.
Thanks, Kylie, and thanks so much for having me. You good to go?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Josh Gilbert. I'm a Worimi man, and I'd just like to start by acknowledging I'm here on Worimi country, which is definitely home for me. The mountain range just outside here is where men's business would take place on our country, and the adjoining hills that kind of surround the rest of our town here in Gloucester is where my family have the first recorded birth in the caves in the mountains. So my dear auntie makes sure that she carries a record of that, and you know, it's clung to her body every moment that she has. So I'd like to acknowledge country, pay my respects to elders past and present on these lands, extend that to all the lands that you're joining from today, and acknowledge the work and the efforts that they've all done right across Australia in continuing to protect, listen, and care for country over time. I'd also like to do a quick acknowledgement and thanks to CSU and the Food Agility CRC, who are supporting my research and who have given me the time, I guess, to contextualize and think about some of these ideas and practices going forward. And I can see Jim Prattley, Professor Jim Prattley, on the call as well, which is great. He's one of my supervisors, and a big thank you to Jim for not only providing the guidance and the information that's needed to kind of get this work off the ground, but also having faith and trust and committing to this longer term vision around what Indigenous agriculture might be. So my task here today is to kind of discuss whether Indigenous farming can save modern agriculture. And I want to start by probably just answering it very quickly and saying, well, yes, of course. And in some cases, probably already has. So my family here on Worimi country first clashed with white farmers in 1825 when the Australian agricultural company AACO, still the biggest agricultural company in Australia, was given 1 million acres of Worimi country as their first initial farm. This is important because it's kind of where a lot of this agricultural ideology and practices started coming, and was really a test bed for what we now know as modern agriculture on this land. So if you go through and read some of the early AACO records, you'll find references to where they've tried to grow things like wheat. Their whole enterprise was built around sheep, which, you know, on coastal country didn't really work all that well. And it's kind of this test case for what modern agriculture and this process of modernity has kind of led to. My family clashed with AACO in about 1827 when some white shepherds started pushing up north into this country, and about 20 minutes from where I am today here in Gloucester, just south, is where this first kind of clash happened between my family, or what became my family. So my dad's ancestors, Indigenous ancestors, clashed with the white shepherds that were left here to look after the sheep. And they clashed. There was this big event that happened on this country, and my dad's Indigenous ancestors stayed behind to look after the young shepherd who had been injured. Over time, they had children and got married, which took a lot of work back in those early days to get approval from all the different people for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people to get married. And they had children, and at this, in the kind of like late or mid 1800s, their child, one of their daughters, Marianne Bugg, became started becoming of age. She learned from both sides of history and of her culture. She learned from her dad, about agriculture and farming, and from her mum, she learned bush foods and this landscape through a different set of eyes. The age of around 10 or 11, Marianne got sent to Parramatta, to an orphanage there that still exists, strangely, and no longer as an orphanage, but the buildings are still there. And through this process, she got sent to Parramatta so that she could, and this is the kind of terminology used at the time, be deemed useful for the company. She got sent down there to learn to read and write, so that she could come back and help the company with their accounts and administration tasks at the time. Marianne might have had a few different ideas, and in this stroke of kind of modern Australian larrikinism, Marianne came back. She married a bushranger who was known as Captain Thunderbolt, and through the knowledge that she had of both the Indigenous bush, the bush foods, and the way in which this country worked, was able to live off the land quite naturally, and then use her non-Indigenous knowledge, the education that she had to be deemed useful for the company. She took that with her and was able to read in newspapers the police reports that were trying to track her and Captain Thunderbolt through the landscape. So they were able to live in this process of moving across the country, escaping police, and in their very acts, I guess, went through and were quite committed to making sure that they were stealing from the rich and kind of living off this lifestyle. So most of their targets were, the Australia Posts of the time and things like that. In true kind of larrikinism sense, Captain Thunderbolt is probably most famously known for robbing a pub, shouting at everyone in the bar a drink at the bartender's cost. As the police came in, he hopped on his horse and rode around in this big track, came back and shouted at everyone the second round. So, it's this kind of story that the romanticism of agriculture and these kind of bushranger folklore, I guess, that we as Australians continue to cling to. But importantly, we often don't acknowledge or don't understand the Indigenous knowledge that has actually allowed a lot of that to happen. I'm just going to quickly share a screen because hopefully this works. I want to share this slide with you. And for me, this is a really important kind of acknowledgement that when we think about Indigenous agriculture and what that might mean, we often fail to acknowledge the diversity of Indigenous people in Australia, or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here. And we often assume that we have one mob, that when we refer to Indigenous people, that you talk about one group of people. And there's quite a lot of concerns and issues around that. And that is that there are over 260 different Indigenous or Aboriginal tribes in Australia, each of whom have their own language groups, their own ways of life, their own experiences of how they acted pre-colonisation and then the impacts of colonisation. So it's often hard to provide and to have an understanding of all the different areas that we have respected and shown, I guess, in terms of Indigenous culture. But it's important to, I guess, think about that that view that there are quite a lot of Indigenous groups around, and that each of them all have their own story. And while we think about this in one kind of group, often you're kind of pulling the similarities between the groups rather than everyone's individual stories. And there's this kind of thinking that I want you to start pondering, and that's that agriculture often came as a result or came before the land was colonized. That while agriculture is a colonizing act, often agriculture beat the colonizers to the indigenous lands. And some stories around that, really pertain to this fact that, as cattle started getting pushed on or escaped some of the white farmers at the time, these kind of went out into new indigenous territories, people who quite often had no idea around what these livestock were or what they would do. And that kind of process, that kind of pushing of cattle, whether purposefully or mistakenly, really had a very nuanced view as to what indigenous agriculture, and what agriculture was going to do to this land. So I think it's important to acknowledge that, and quite often I think it's important to note that different indigenous tribes, different indigenous groups were also pushed upon new lands that they quite often wouldn't have an association with or had an association with, but were really forced upon this new landscape. And while that's important, is because when some of the early colonial records around what indigenous agriculture pre-colonization looked like, a lot of those landscapes were already damaged or impacted by Western agriculture. So you get the likes of Uncle Bruce Pascoe, who uses white journals, white narrative to articulate a sense that indigenous agriculture was very much alive and thriving, and that is kind of impacted in very many ways by this sense that agriculture had already pushed through a lot of these areas, and that these lands were already impacted by white colonizers before actual people got there to record some of these stories. And the country I'm on is just here above where it says southeast on the coast here, and it's a very small little group called Worimi, just represented in the yellow on the screen. So that's home for me. Our lands extend from almost Newcastle in the south, out up through the Barrington Tops, which is some of the last remaining Gondwana rainforests, up through that country up to Gloucester, back across the coast to almost Foster, or just above Foster, Tuncurry, and back down the coast. So it's quite, it's a large-ish kind of nation, certainly not as big as some of the others out west, and particularly the Wiradjuri. But it was seen, Worimi country was seen as this, by Indigenous nations particularly, as a very wealthy area that, because we clung to the coast here and had this affinity between salt and fresh water all the time, that the Indigenous groups right across the country could kind of recognise that Worimi country were quite wealthy because they had this access to a whole range of food sources that you couldn't get from a range of other areas. So if I flick to the next slide, I want to pose this idea and why I think this is important when we think about Indigenous agriculture and whether Indigenous farming can save modern agriculture. This is a quote gifted to me, I think, by Stan Grant Jr. And it's this kind of idea, I think, that came through a conversation with him and my other supervisors, to say that an Aboriginal person farming today is authentically Aboriginal as what he or she would have been over time. We're the same people, but we're just a people in change. And this is a rhetoric that's really important, a quote that really stuck out to me, because while I was trying to understand what Indigenous agriculture might look like today, too often I think personally I got caught up in this view that we needed to note the difference between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. We needed to really contextualize Indigenous farming in a new way. And Stan quite rightly pointed out to me that any Aboriginal person farming today is still an Indigenous person, that Aboriginal people have also proceeded through this process of transforming through modernity into the people we are today. And this is important because often we get caught up on this fact of this puristic sense of what Indigenous people or Aboriginality is in Australia. We think about it in terms, in very kind of fixed, rigid terms, this static view of culture, that an Aboriginal person should have dark skin, should practice culture every day, will live off the land and in harmony, when in actual fact, Indigenous culture, similar to white culture, has also progressed through a process of modernity, that we've also been engaged in a whole range of other industries, including agriculture, since colonization. And this is an idea that when you think about, it actually provides a lot more scope. It actually broadens up the perspective of what Indigenous agriculture is, its importance, and where this kind of conversation should head into the future. So this is a view that I think is very kind of critical and crucial, that we acknowledge that Indigenous people have gone through this process of modernity. And maybe the best example I can share of this is the scale and size of Indigenous agriculture today. And I'll share that in the next slide. And while this is important, it's because we know that Indigenous people were practicing what non-Indigenous people recognized as agriculture, even in the late 1800s. So there is documents within people's death certificates and in people's occupations that are listed that entitle them, that share the title of Indigenous farmer, even back in the late 1800s. And this is a process that governments right across the world have kind of led. It's a conversation that governments and political institutions, whether it be in Australia or the US and Canada, have all engaged in thinking that we can push Indigenous people through a process of going towards modernity, whether that be assimilation or a range of other things. And quite often that view was rooted in agriculture. So in Australia, we had this kind of process that happened a lot around Sydney, that where non-Indigenous people, particularly political people, were pushing Indigenous people onto farms so that they could actually try and go throughout this process of modernity, that they will use agriculture as the way forward for regional economies. We know some of the very early records here talk about Indigenous fishermen going and collecting fish and selling to non-Indigenous people, as fresh food throughout this process. In America, they talk about this being so successful in Canada that Indigenous farmers were so successful over there that the government actually implemented a whole series of policy to prevent Indigenous people from having a big broadacre farm, so that they couldn't farm to the same success as what they would do. So you get this process of government in Canada implementing policy that said that Indigenous farmers couldn't use modern technology because they were so successful. They had to use kind of basic peasant infrastructure and taught Indigenous people how to use that as kind of the way forward, when Indigenous farmers already knew that that process wasn't right. You have the homesteading acts that happened in the US and Canada as well. And similarly in Australia, we had a whole heap of land that was taken up by soldier settlement blocks. And all of this was a process of taking Indigenous land and transforming it into something that's seen as successful or used land. And while this is so important, it's because often those lands were Indigenous held, they didn't benefit Indigenous people, and Indigenous people were the ones that were giving up a lot of that land and knowledge of that land to move forward. The other kind of policy that I think is important in an Australian context, and it happened around the world in Canada and the US as well, is this process of having certificates to say whether you're Indigenous or not, whether you wanted to identify as an Aboriginal person or not. And you had these certificates that came out, you know, in the early 1900s that were really terrible and basically asked Indigenous people to commit to not engaging in Indigenous-like acts. And the reason why these were so restrictive, they restricted the amount of movement that an Indigenous person could have, that they wouldn't be able, that we as people wouldn't be able to move after dark, for instance, or couldn't engage in the same bars and areas like that. And why that's important is because in what we saw in Canada, for instance, is that these policies were really restrictive upon Indigenous people, that all of a sudden Indigenous people couldn't sell their products at the same rate or at the same availability as non-Indigenous people. That led to a whole heap of bad behaviour where Indigenous people were selling their products to non-Indigenous people illegally because they didn't have the right documentation, and then non-Indigenous people taking advantage of that and threatening people and kicking them off their property after the goods were delivered. So all of these impacts, all of the narrative around Indigenous agriculture is important, because quite often Indigenous people thrived in terms of Western agriculture, whether it be here or around the world. And by taking this fluid view of culture, we actually can start unpacking that. We can start acknowledging that Indigenous people had already been engaging in an industry that was quite exclusionary in some instances, and that Indigenous agriculture is so important. The view in this kind of fluid sense around culture is so important for the progression of Indigenous people and our views, particularly in agriculture going forward. So why is this so important? Well, this map kind of tells the yarn, I guess, for me, in a very simple image. We know prior to colonization that Indigenous people were in control, had self-determining systems and infrastructure, you know, and governance models that oversaw all of Australia as what we know it today. And we went through this process kind of very quickly to acknowledge this kind of transformation that happened here on Australia's landscape. So, you know, up until as late as 1965, that's, you know, within almost my father's generation, there was very limited, other than freehold title that wasn't really recorded, there was very limited view as to what Indigenous assets were actually owned by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And what we saw is this kind of transformation over time. And you can see the map in 2018, which shows quite a lot of land that is Indigenous held. And these maps aren't perfect. They don't show freehold, and they definitely don't show you know, work that's done that completely understands the Indigenous estate in Australia. But the government guesstimate, if I can put it that way, as to how big the Indigenous estate is in Australia is around 40 to 50% of Australia's landmass still being held by Indigenous people. Now, that landmass is absolutely crucial to ensuring that we are able to feed populations going forward. And we know with the impacts of climate change that this land will become more suitable and more relied upon because of all the ranges of different things that happen when climate change continues to impact our country. So for me, that tells us that we need to start having a conversation around Indigenous agriculture, that we need to understand the size and scale of what Indigenous farmers are in Australia, how they're using this land, whether it's being done by Indigenous people or whether it is actually being done by non-Indigenous people, the farming practices on these lands. And we need to start thinking around what these models and these conversations will look like going forward. So there's a lot of work to be done. There is very limited literature regarding the adaptability and ingenuity of Indigenous people in the Western agricultural systems. Instead, in Australia, we take this very fixed view around what Indigenous agriculture is. And you have people like Uncle Bruce Pascoe and a whole heap of white academics who argue and have this contention around what Indigenous agriculture is and you know, whether it meets a colonial definition of agriculture. This view is, you know, incredibly far behind. It's about 40 years behind that of the US and Canada. And to be honest, I can't see any quick wins around how we're going to move this forward. There's a lot of work that needs to go into this conversation. We know it has to be Indigenous led, and the Indigenous people need to be brought on this journey as well. And we know that the atmosphere in Australia probably isn't fantastic. There are some signs of hope though. So I don't want to make it all sound doom and gloom, but in Australia, and particularly in the last 2 or 3 years, we've had this kind of resurgence of agricultural organisations who have slowly started making commitments towards Indigenous people in terms of reconciliation action plans. Now, a reconciliation action plan, or RAP, is a company's commitment towards Indigenous people. And quite often they have targets around employment or procurement. Now, the RAP process certainly isn't perfect in Australia. So we know that there are more employment targets and commitments to Indigenous jobs in Australia than what there actually are Indigenous people in Australia. And that's quite concerning. But we know that this is a commitment and a process that organisations of all different types and sizes and scales have commenced and have been doing for quite a number of years in some industries. Agriculture has been very late to the party in terms of reconciliation action plans. And just in the last 2 or 3 years, you have some big companies like AACO, for instance. The Royal Agricultural Society of New South Wales, I noticed, have just released a reconciliation action plan. So you get this kind of work that's kind of being done. But the hesitation I have with some of these reconciliation action plans is that while they commit to employment and procurement targets to Indigenous people, they often don't, that's often seen in kind of a negative light, that rather than understanding and appreciating that Indigenous agriculture is already taking place, that Indigenous people have these large land holdings and there's a lot of opportunity going forward. Rather than meeting as equal parties to have these discussions, you have commitments in reconciliation action plans that see Indigenous people as slightly lesser. And that's part of the conversation that needs to change in Australia. The other opportunity I see in this is that we have to, and we have the opportunity to really understand the size and scale of Indigenous agriculture. At the moment, there is no public cohesive database that really provides a perspective on the size and scale. We don't know how many Indigenous farmers are in Australia who are already farming. We don't know how big they are. We don't know what their opportunities or what their dreams are, what they're farming, where they're farming, how they have a voice within our government, agri-political organisations. All of this provides a really great opportunity for us to provide a new perspective on what Indigenous agriculture is and how that might go forward here. And for me, that's where a lot of the work needs to be done first before actually looking at these kind of broader perspectives on what Indigenous agriculture might become in Australia. So that's a lot. I think I've just given you the 30-minute rundown on the current state of Indigenous agriculture. I'm going to spend some time at the end to show you where I think we might head. But while I just want to give you like a 2-minute video that shows the perspective of Indigenous agriculture to mob and really, I think, demonstrates how recent this narrative is, how quick this conversation needs to happen, and where these opportunities might come to life. So I'm just going to show you this quick video. It's called The Wilmaringal Freak, and I'll grab it up for you in a second. It's a video done by an Aboriginal man who is called Sonny Orchard, and he talks about his dad, who was a shearing contractor. So I'm just going to show this for you now. I'll pull it up on the screen.
Me and my brother were all born and bred on Wilmaringle, and we all saw his dad at the Wilmaringle shed. My dad, Dudley Orchard, was a gun shearer in Australia. During the 1950s, 60s and 70s, he was the best. And he also had a crack at the world title. The world record stood at that time was 292 sheep shorn in one 8-hour day. And on the 12th of August 1958, Dudley Orchard shore 326 sheep in an 8-hour day. But he couldn't claim the title because he was an Aboriginal. And that was back before, we wasn't even classed as people, back before the referendum in 1967. During that era, the pubs were even segregated. You know, the white contractors, they had to buy beer for the Aboriginal shearers and shed hands. Yeah, 10 years later, that was a year after the referendum in 1968, the contractor Dudley was shearing with suggested to have another crack at this world record. And Dudley said he wasn't interested in it anymore. He didn't have to prove himself anymore. So he just settled on shearing about 200 a day. Yeah, well, in the 70s, 1970s, he was an old man, but still shearing. And, young fellas will come from all over, from Victoria, Queensland, WA, all still chasing, wanting to beat the gun, and they walk on the board and they see an old black man there and say, "Where's the gun?" My dad, he just kept on shearing, and he was still the gun right up till the early 80s when he retired. Nobody ever beat him. The 12th of August is a very special day for me in honour of my father. I never work on that day. It means more to me than Australia Day. That's the story that inspired me to write this song, The Wilmaringle Creek.
I'm just going to pull it up there because I think this is a really important narrative that within living memory, within a time that is not that long ago, the 70s and 80s, you still had this Indigenous man, a gun shearer, who was unable to access his title because of the fact that he was Indigenous. He was denied, the right to have that title, was denied the opportunity to do that. And, there's the yarn there that, he just settled and that he went on sharing his 200 a day and that was it. And for me, these are the kind of heartbreaking conversations that are associated with Indigenous agriculture that we need to start unpacking, that we need to address, and that we need to start having honest conversations around going forward. And we know that these narratives happen everywhere, and this is just one example of the yarn, and there's a lot more of these that we need to be had. So this is the 70s and 80s, and coming forward, about 20 years, you had the decision of Mabo that really kind of shook up the agricultural world, where a commitment made by the High Court, the highest court in Australia, that Indigenous people had native title rights over land really kind of led to this fear-mongering by politicians, and particularly in the agricultural sphere, that basically you would end up with an Aboriginal person in your backyard claiming that a site was important. And while we know the cultural landscape and the many elements that make up a cultural landscape in Australia are all important to Indigenous people, we often these views were kind of oversensitized by media and government politicians. And this happened particularly in the agricultural sector. So going forward, what you've got now in agricultural policy, and the NFF's roadmap, for instance, kind of leans on this, is a commitment to working with Aboriginal people as long as that's contextualized and done in the context of what native title is. And we will engage with Indigenous people only to the extent that we can have this yarn around native title and make agreements around it where we both benefit from this conversation. Even the NFF's diversity strategy has Aboriginal people kind of secondary to gender diversity. So the way the roadmap's laid out says gender diversity, and one of the subsets of that is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander inclusion. So this kind of commitment going forward still, I think, is exacerbated by these kind of views around pre-referendum of whether Indigenous people, would meet the census statistics and, met the definition of people really by the Crown at that early stage. And then, in the later parts of the 1990s and even into the early 2000s, we had this fear-mongering around Indigenous native title. So all of that said, there's quite a lot of work to be done. These kind of views are also, in quite a fearful sense, in some ways exacerbated by Indigenous people. And we see this kind of happen in the native food space, where Aboriginal farmers who are farming native foods are really subjected to an industry that isn't all that supportive of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people either. So despite native foods being seen as this multi-million-dollar, potentially billion-dollar industry, only 3% of revenue actually goes back into the hands of Indigenous people. So over 97% of the benefit of the Australian bush food industry goes back into non-Indigenous hands. And that's quite concerning, because we often have this view and this sense around Indigenous agriculture, and it's perpetuated by this view that, oh, well, at least the Indigenous people can farm Indigenous products. But in reality, what happens is we end up with this very different situation where even Indigenous people engaging in a conversation around bush foods doesn't necessarily mean that we have equal rights to that. And for instance, some of that process and the knowledge around bush foods has been lost and stolen by non-Indigenous people. And some examples of that, whether it's macadamia or lily pillies and rye berries, that whole industry is owned by non-Indigenous people. And, even the plant breeders' rights for some of our native foods are owned by non-Indigenous people. But there is some hope in all this. We have some very interesting models that are coming out and are evident, whether in Australia or around the world, that show this kind of view that this conversation's moving forward. In Australia, there's a place called Nauru, which is owned by a solicitor and his partner. And they've been very interesting to follow. I followed them for probably 18 months. And they've gone on this journey of engaging with local Aboriginal groups to their area, gifting some of the land through a continual land use agreement, and basically saying to the mob down there, this is yours, do with it what you want. Let's have this connection going forward. And I think that's a kind of very individual on-farm conversation that provides a lot of opportunity, but also gives the sovereignty and the ability for mob to kind of have these conversations and access sites that are important to them, and also provide the education between both the Indigenous people that are there, who can learn from being on country, and also the non-Indigenous people who need to be taken on the journey as well. Some interesting models out of the US. I'll just share two quickly. One's a place called Soulfire Farm, which I'd encourage you to have a look at. It's led by a Indigenous person called Leah Penniman, who has really worked on upskilling Indigenous people in America. And it's quite a relatively small place, but it shows this thirst of enthusiasm and passion for agriculture held by Indigenous people in America. All of her training courses are all oversubscribed. She can't create or produce enough training courses over there for all the mob that want to access it. And for me, that shows something where we might head in Australia going forward, acknowledging that there's a lot of work and a 40-year gap to get there, but there are a lot of opportunities providing this kind of training back to mob. And it's important in an Australian context because we know that the Indigenous youth demographic is the only growing youth demographic in Australia. So it means we're going to have more young Aboriginal people going forward. And we also know that there are very low levels of Indigenous university graduates. So Jim on the line, has done research that shows that there's less than 5 Indigenous ag graduates across Australia every year, which means that there's a lot of work to be done. The other model, which I think is absolutely pivotal and where I would encourage us to start spending some more time, is really looking at the Intertribal Agricultural Council, the IAC. Now, this is an organization that was formed in 1987 and basically has enabled and unlocked Indigenous agriculture in America. What it does, which I think is kind of genius in so many ways, is take this very holistic view, this wide-spanning view of what Indigenous agriculture is. And therefore, you end up with Indigenous ranchers, cattle farmers. You have Indigenous people who are farming bush foods and a whole range of commodities in between. And all of these get recognised as Indigenous farmers by the Intertribal Ag Council. So the IAC actually provides a trademark, not on the product, but actually trademarks the person as an Indigenous person who is performing an agricultural act. And all the commodities that come out of those are registered through the IAC, and it's seen as this kind of council that certifies these. Also provides a lot of training opportunities for young Black folk in America, and whether that be on the ground, but also online. So they do a lot of webinars, and they have a lot of information available online that you'll be able to access if you're interested. The other kind of great thing about the IAC, which is a thing where I think we need to think about in Australia, is the IAC has a voice directly to the US Department of Agriculture. So the head of the Intertribal Ag Council actually sits on the USDA board and provides advice and information to the USDA, which provides a direct link around Indigenous agriculture to the department. Now, I think in Australia, this is a conversation worth having because I think we're going to head down this route. So we know that, for instance, a lot of federally, the Labor Party have already started having a discussion around treaty. We know that's happening at a whole heap of other levels. And that conversation is really going to change the way Indigenous people engage in conversations, and nowhere more should that conversation be had in the agricultural sense, given this kind of long-standing connection, and also because of that large land ownership that we know is going to have to be relied upon going forward. So there's heaps of opportunities there. A direct voice to the Federal Department of Agriculture is going to be super important for Indigenous agriculture going forward, and provides a huge opportunity for us to continue to have this conversation. I think it's also worthwhile noting that through the process of getting towards treaty, there's a process of truth-telling that a lot of mobs are going to go through. And why I think it's important, why I mention that, is because the process of truth telling is really going to change the way Indigenous people continue to discuss agriculture in Australia. We know that there's been so many terrible acts committed by non-Indigenous farmers towards Indigenous farmers, whether that be stolen land, stolen wages, ill treatment of Aboriginal people, particularly women, kind of slave labour, unfair conditions. All of these will be discussed through a truth-telling process here in Australia. And I think that kind of puts agriculture at warning a bit, but also when we come out of that process, if we can do that in a positive light and see what some of the opportunities are in this space, we actually provide and have an opportunity to have a really big conversation around agriculture and our role in going forward. So I want to leave some time for questions. So in short, to the question of can Indigenous farming save modern agriculture, in some ways it already has, and the Indigenous people have been working on cattle stations since the very first inception of agriculture or Western agriculture in Australia. There's so many instances of this, but often we don't see or provide Indigenous people with a perspective around agriculture and don't make that connection. We know that there's a lot of work to be done going forward, and all of that is going to take time. But given how far we are behind in Australia and the importance of this conversation, we really need to rush and have these conversations now, do it properly, and really open up the yarn, because without all that ability, what I fear most is that in 10, 20 years down the track, with the continuance of climate change impacting our landscape, we're going to have a land that has a lot of agricultural potential that non-Indigenous people and Indigenous people are going to meet on. And the clash between culture and without having the big strategic picture, the vision as to where we're all heading, is going to mean that we're going to struggle as Indigenous and non-Indigenous farmers to move forward. So there's a lot of opportunity, a lot of work to be done. But realistically, Indigenous agriculture is so important to that broader view, that long-term perspective of farming, not only here in Worimi country, but all countries around Australia. So happy to leave it there, I guess, and take any questions.
Yeah, that's excellent, Josh. If anyone wants to ask a question live, just pop their hand up and yeah, I can allow you to talk, or if you prefer, just pop in either the Q&A or the chat function as well. Okay, Anita.
Hi, thanks Kylie, and thank you Joshua for a very interesting presentation. You've referred to things that I did not know, so it's useful to have that context and a better understanding, particularly historically, but also new initiatives in Australia, but also elsewhere. One of the things that, just take your point that you mentioned about that issue of the commercialisation of bush foods, for example, and I would suggest there's also potential around bush medicines and what that means for Indigenous people in Australia, but also elsewhere in the world, is that in my conversations with farmers or with other people in Australia, there's very limited understanding or recognition or awareness, if you could put it like that, of Indigenous knowledge and what that actually means for intellectual property and commercialisation. And I'm wondering about your thoughts on that, please.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Anita. And I noticed that you and Dana as well also asked about the Soulfire Farm example. So I've just put a link to that in the chat. But effectively, I think my view around this, around bush foods particularly, is somewhat informed by the US example. So we know that there is a lot of knowledge and information that Indigenous people hold over bush foods and bush medicines. There's a whole range of other purposes. I'll just use as bush foods as the kind of terminology for all those going forward. But we know that there's a whole heap of knowledge and culture and practices that underpin all of those. In my view, and you know, I've done quite a bit of work in bush foods in the past. So I helped write the Kakadu plum strategy, the commercialisation strategy of it. That was probably about 5 years ago, and a range of other projects working with businesses, where I think this conversation needs to have this kind of almost in Australia, where we've kind of lost bush foods. And I don't mean that in a bad sense, but I mean that it's often been taken out of the hands of Indigenous people who, you know, are obviously the people who should have the inherent rights to it. So I think for me, the conversation around Indigenous cultural IP or ICIP is important, but we can't go backwards. We can't say to all the non-Indigenous people who have kind of taken on these industries and invested their life savings and have made a whole range of decisions, you know, as late as kind of the 60s and 70s, we can't say to them, well, actually, pack up your stuff. Aboriginal people are going to take over this and go forward with it. So where I think the conversation needs to head is similar to the example of the IAC, and that's to provide a trademark system that certifies Indigenous products as being Indigenous grown, and actually try and argue for a premium price on those products, recognizing the cultural knowledge that Indigenous people and the growers have over that. So that's kind of how the US have dealt with it. And I think it's a really good strategy because it does recognize that non-Indigenous people have also taken it on. That we've already lost commodities such as macadamia nuts, for instance, that, you know, is a bush food that is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And I think it's the fairest way of dealing with it without kind of, you know, tearing the whole industry apart and trying to rebuild it.
Thank you.
Okay, Josh, and now we have very familiar and wanting to ask a question with Jim Pratley.
G'day, Josh. How you doing?
Right. How are you?
Good, mate. We're moving up to the election for the Australian government. What will be the differences in going forward with your views if we stay with the coalition or move to Labor?
Good question. I probably think it doesn't make too much difference. It might just stifle the process. So, you know, I'm pretty apolitical. I don't really mind who gets in, but I think the process of treaty that Labor have committed to provide a platform to have these conversations a bit quicker than the Liberal Party, but I think there are other ways of having these conversations if they don't happen through treaty. So I think they'll still progress. It might just be the timing that, you know, might be impacted by that, but I think that outcome will eventually get the same in the long term.
And so what will the difference be if we get a treaty versus not getting a treaty?
I think it's the process of the treaty that's important. So that ability to have truth telling will actually unearth a lot of these stories that might not get unearthed as quickly as if we don't do that. And unfortunately, I think, you know, if we delay these kind of conversations too far, we actually lose a lot of them, given the life expectancy of Indigenous people being so much less than non-Indigenous people in Australia already, and just the ability to tell those stories. So I think there's a risk that might happen, whereas a treaty process will enable, I guess, a lot of that truth telling to happen. The other thing that I think will be important is that at some stage, agriculture has to have this conversation with Indigenous people. And for me, there's a fear that if we I'm not really sure what the process is or the awakening that agriculture has to have, or how that will be triggered if we don't have a treaty conversation. I think it's very much easy to have your head in the sand in the agricultural sector and continue to have a yarn about native title and trying to convince the Indigenous people of your agricultural beliefs in that without having the footing of treaty, where if there is a conversation around treaty, that will very much impact the way in which agriculture will engage with mob. Hope that covers it.
Okay, it doesn't look like there's any other questions there, and I'm just aware of the time. So massive thanks to you, Josh, for coming on board and yeah, doing the first webinar in our Expanded Horizons series. You know, you sharing your history and knowledge and passion for Indigenous agriculture has been outstanding, and it's great to hear the conversations have begun, but it's just so important that we keep them going. So thank you so much. Yeah, I wish you well, and please stay in touch. And I'd also like to thank everyone else that's come on board today. And yeah, just a shout out to sort of keep an eye out on our socials and other areas for the next series of Expanded Horizons that'll be coming up next month. Thanks, Josh.
Great. Thanks, Kylie, and thanks all.